Samantha Reed clutched her phone so tightly that her knuckles turned white. The voice on the other end of the call was filled with barely restrained fury. "Where the hell is she, Samantha?" Ethan Carter's deep, commanding tone sent a shiver down her spine. Samantha swallowed hard, her eyes darting around the empty bridal suite. The ivory wedding dress, meant for Victoria Hale, hung untouched on a velvet hanger, its pristine silk mocking her. The room was silent, save for the distant chatter of wedding guests outside. Victoria was gone. She wasn't late. She had vanished. "She'll be here soon," Samantha lied, her voice small. A harsh curse shot through the speaker. She was supposed to be here an hour ago. Then came the sound of glass shattering on the other end. Ethan had thrown something, no doubt in frustration. Samantha winced. The entire business world was watching this wedding. Investors, clients, business moguls, people Ethan needed to impress. And now his fiancée had humiliated him in the worst possible way. His breathing was ragged when he spoke again. "Find her. Now." The line went dead. Samantha stood frozen, heart pounding so violently she thought it might burst from her chest. Find Victoria. That was impossible. She had already tried. The maid of honor had no idea where she was. The bridesmaids were panicked. The driver confirmed that Victoria had been picked up hours ago, but she never made it to the venue. She had run away. The truth was so brutal that Samantha felt sick. This wasn't just about Ethan's embarrassment. His entire reputation was at stake. If this wedding collapsed, the media would tear him apart. His enemies would see him as weak. His competitors would smell blood. And he would never forgive her for failing to fix it. Her pulse pounded against her temples. 5 years working as Ethan Carter's secretary had taught her one thing. He didn't accept failure. Ever. His famous mantra echoed in her head. Find a way. Samantha took a shaky breath. There was only one way. A ridiculous, reckless, insane way. Her gaze flicked to the wedding dress. Her fingers trembled as she touched the fabric. Could she really do this? Could she walk down that aisle, stand before 100 powerful guests, and marry a man who didn't love her, who would hate her the moment he realized what she had done? No, but she had no choice. Samantha exhaled sharply, then grabbed the dress. She didn't have much time. If she hesitated, Ethan would come storming in here himself. Her hands moved on autopilot, pulling off her blouse, stepping out of her skirt. She stripped down to nothing but trembling nerves and a rapidly escalating sense of dread. The dress was heavier than she expected, suffocating almost as she zipped it up. It fit surprisingly well. A knock on the door nearly sent her to the floor. "Miss Hale, it's time." Samantha's throat closed. She wasn't Victoria. She was about to walk out there and lie to everyone. Lie to Ethan. Lie to an entire room of people who could ruin her life. But she couldn't back out now. She forced herself forward, her legs unsteady as she stepped into the hallway. The wedding march had already begun. Guests turned their heads expectantly. Photographers lifted their cameras. And then, at the end of the aisle, stood him. Ethan Carter. His tailored black suit fit his powerful frame with effortless perfection, his dark hair sleek, his jaw tight with barely concealed rage. His icy blue eyes locked onto hers, widening in confusion. Samantha's knees nearly gave out. He knew. He knew the moment he saw her that something was wrong. His expression shifted from confusion to pure fury. She reached him, her breath shallow. He grabbed her wrist, his grip like iron. "Where?" "Victoria." Samantha's lips parted, but no words came. A priest cleared his throat. "Shall we begin?" Ethan's fingers flexed against her skin. She felt his rage, his disbelief. But the guests were watching. The cameras were flashing. Samantha forced herself to lift her chin. She wasn't sure where she found the courage, but she whispered the only words that would keep Ethan from walking away. "I didn't have a choice." His jaw clenched, his nostrils flared. And then, with the slow precision of a man barely containing his fury, he let go of her wrist and turned toward the priest. The ceremony began. Samantha's heart beat like a war drum. She didn't dare look at Ethan again. Not when he was standing next to her, tense as a coiled spring. Not when the vows were spoken, his voice clipped and cold. Not when the golden ring slid onto her trembling finger. Only when the priest finally spoke the words, "You may kiss the bride," did she risk a glance at her new husband. Ethan leaned in, his breath hot against her ear. "What the hell have you done?" he whispered. And then, for the cameras, he kissed her. Samantha barely felt Ethan's lips on hers before he pulled away, his grip tightening on her waist as if to silently warn her. The applause erupted around them, a deafening wave of cheers and camera flashes. She forced herself to smile, playing the part of a blissful bride, but her heart pounded against her ribs. Ethan Carter was furious. And when Ethan Carter was furious, people suffered. His fingers brushed against hers briefly before he dropped her hand, his posture stiff, his entire body radiating tension. The ceremony continued in a blur. Samantha barely registered the officiant's words, her mind spinning as she realized the depth of what she had done. She had married him. When the priest finally announced them husband and wife, Ethan turned to the guests, his lips curving into a tight, controlled smile that didn't reach his eyes. He leaned closer, his voice a low growl only she could hear. "Enjoy this moment, sweetheart," he murmured darkly. "Because the second we're alone, you're going to explain exactly how the hell this happened." A chill ran down Samantha's spine. But she held her head high, matching his facade. She had survived 5 years working under Ethan Carter. 5 years of impossible deadlines, icy glares, and unrealistic expectations. She had learned how to hold her own. So she smiled, laced her fingers through his for the cameras, and walked down the aisle beside him as if nothing was wrong. The reception hall was a vision of elegance. Crystal chandeliers bathed the space in a warm golden glow, while waiters in crisp black suits moved seamlessly between the elegantly dressed guests, offering champagne and hors d'oeuvres, offering champagne and hors d'oeuvres. The sound of laughter and clinking glasses filled the air, but Samantha barely heard any of it. Ethan played the role of the perfect groom effortlessly. He greeted guests, shook hands, and accepted congratulations with a charming smile that was so convincing Samantha might have believed it herself, if she didn't know better. But every time he looked at her, his eyes were cold, blistering. Samantha did her best to stay in the background, but of course, that didn't last long. Well, 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 quite the unexpected turn of events. Samantha turned to find Mindy Langley sauntering toward her, champagne flute in hand, her expression dripping with amusement. As the daughter of one of Ethan's wealthiest investors, Mindy had always made it painfully clear that she considered herself above Samantha. "You didn't tell us," Victoria had. "Changed so dramatically," Mindy added, her voice mockingly sweet. Samantha didn't react, but her stomach clenched as Mindy's friend, Anna, laughed beside her. "She sure has some nerve pretending like we wouldn't notice," Anna sneered. "She must think she pulled off the performance of the century." Samantha opened her mouth to speak, to defend herself. Not that it would matter to these women, but before she could, a deep voice cut through the conversation. "There you are." Ethan's arm slid around her waist, the warmth of his palm pressing against her lower back. Samantha stiffened in surprise as he pulled her closer. She turned, meeting his dangerously unreadable gaze. "Ladies," he greeted smoothly, his expression as charming as ever. "I see you've met my wife." The word sent a strange thrill down Samantha's spine. She knew it was just for show, but still, hearing it come from Ethan Carter's lips felt surreal. Mindy's expression faltered for a split second before she quickly recovered, offering a plastic smile. "Of course, we were just getting reacquainted." "Good," Ethan said, his voice smooth but laced with something undeniable. A warning. Then, to Samantha's absolute shock, he took her hand. "Stay with me," he ordered, interlacing their fingers. "And don't let go." Samantha barely had time to process his words before he turned, leading her away from the conversation. The warmth of his touch sent an unexpected shiver up her spine. She knew this was a game, a carefully calculated move on Ethan's part to shut down gossip before it could spread. But still, he was holding her hand. The night continued in a whirlwind of interactions, forced smiles, and polite laughter. Samantha followed Ethan's lead, doing her best to maintain the illusion. But then a sound rippled through the room. The clinking of champagne glasses. "Kiss the bride." The chant started softly at first, then grew louder, until everyone joined in. Samantha's pulse skyrocketed. Ethan turned to her, his blue eyes dark and unreadable. For a split second, the world blurred around them, the weight of 100 stares pressing in. She barely had time to react before Ethan's hands slid up to her cheeks. "Mind if I kiss you?" he asked in a low, almost mocking tone. Samantha's breath hitched, but before she could respond, he leaned in. The moment their lips met, a shockwave ripped through her. She expected it to be brief, a light brush of lips to satisfy the guests. But Ethan didn't pull away. Instead, his grip tightened, his lips moving against hers in a slow, deliberate motion that sent heat curling through her stomach. He drew her in, deepening the kiss with a possessive intensity that made her knees weaken. Samantha didn't mean to respond. She didn't mean to melt, but somehow she did. Her fingers curled into his suit, her breath catching as his hand slipped lower, pressing against the small of her back. The guests erupted into cheers, but Samantha barely heard them. For just one moment, one impossible, terrifying moment, she let herself forget that this was all an illusion. Then, just as suddenly as it began, Ethan pulled away. He lingered for a beat, his forehead almost touching hers, his breath still warm against her lips. Then, without another word, he turned back to the crowd, flashing a carefully composed smirk. The applause thundered around them. Samantha, heart-pounding, forced a smile. But she knew the truth. This wasn't real. And the second this night was over, she would have to face the consequences. The moment the reception ended, Samantha barely had time to take a breath before Ethan's hand wrapped around her wrist in an unrelenting grip. Without a word, he led her through the grand hall, his strides long and determined. His grip wasn't gentle, but it wasn't painful either. It was the grip of a man barely holding his temper in check. She stole a glance at his face, at the sharp angles of his jaw, the slight tension in his clenched teeth. His polite mask had finally cracked, and she could feel the storm brewing beneath his carefully restrained exterior. The second they were out of sight from the guests and inside one of the private rooms of the estate, Ethan released her wrist, stepping back as if he couldn't stand being near her. The sound of the heavy wooden door slamming shut behind them echoed through the room. "What the hell was that?" His voice was calm, dangerously so. Samantha forced herself to remain composed. "I told you," she said quietly. I didn't have a choice. Ethan let out a sharp, humorless laugh. No choice. You're telling me you had no other options but to walk down that aisle and marry me. He ran a hand through his dark hair, exhaling harshly. Do you have any idea what you've done, Samantha? Her hands curled into fists at her sides. I saved you. Ethan's icy blue eyes locked onto hers, dark with fury. Saved me. He took a slow step forward, his towering presence overwhelming. You lied to me. You lied to me. You lied to me. You expect me to be grateful. Samantha's chest ached, but she didn't back down. I expect you to understand, she shot back. Victoria was gone. I was the only one who could stop that wedding from turning into a scandal that would ruin your reputation. Ethan let out another bitter laugh. So that's it? You thought you'd play hero? His voice dropped lower, his gaze piercing. Or did you think this was your chance? That maybe, just maybe, you stood in for her, I'd suddenly look at you differently. The words hit harder than she expected. Samantha swallowed, pushing past the sting of his accusation. I don't expect anything from you, Ethan. But I won't apologize for doing what I had to do. His nostrils flared, and for a moment, he just stared at her. Then, exhaling sharply, he stepped away, raking a hand through his hair. This marriage, he said coldly, means nothing to me. Samantha forced herself to nod, even as something inside her twisted painfully. I know. Ethan turned his back to her, staring out the large window. You will stay in the mansion, he said finally, but don't think for a second that this changes anything. Samantha bit the inside of her cheek. She had expected this, prepared for this, but hearing it still made her chest tighten. What happens next? She asked after a long silence. Ethan exhaled through his nose, his voice void of emotion. We pretend. We pretend. We smile. We play our roles until I figure out how to fix this mess. Samantha nodded, though the lump in her throat made it difficult to speak. And then, Ethan turned, his expression unreadable. Then we end this. The words should have made her feel relieved. Instead, they felt like a blade slipping between her ribs. She squared her shoulders. Fine. Without another word, Ethan moved toward the door, pausing just before opening it. He didn't look back when he spoke again. You'll have your own room. Then he left. Samantha stood there for a long moment, the weight of everything sinking in. She had married Ethan Carter. She had lied to an entire room of powerful people. And now she was stuck in a marriage that wasn't real. For a moment, she allowed herself to feel the exhaustion, the whirlwind of emotions threatening to consume her. But then, she lifted her chin and took a slow, steady breath. She had survived worse. And if Ethan Carter thought he could break her that easily, he was in for a surprise. The first few days of their marriage were filled with silence. Ethan barely spoke to her. At work, he was the same as ever. Ruthless, professional, untouchable. But at home, he treated her like a shadow, acknowledging her presence only when necessary. Samantha didn't push. She didn't expect anything from him. But she hadn't expected him to turn her into his personal assistant at home, too. One night, she was lying on the massive bed in her guest room when her phone buzzed. Ethan. Come to my room. Frowning, she hesitated before sighing and pushing herself up. When she entered his room, she found him lounging on the sleek leather couch, his tie loosened, shirt sleeves rolled up. He barely looked at her as he tossed an empty glass in her direction. Get rid of that. Samantha stared at the glass, then back at him. Ethan finally glanced at her, one brow lifting. Do I look like I'm joking? Something inside her snapped. You have staff for this, she said, crossing her arms. His lips curled into a smirk. They're off duty. And last I checked, you're my wife. Samantha clenched her teeth, grabbing the glass before spinning on her heel. As she walked away, she muttered, You've got 2 feet. You could have done it yourself. She didn't think he'd heard her. But as she reached the doorway, his low, amused voice followed her. I could, Ethan mused, but it's much more entertaining watching you do it. Samantha stormed out, gripping the glass so tightly she nearly shattered it. Marriage to Ethan Carter was going to be hell. Samantha had learned to endure Ethan Carter's cold demeanor, but nothing prepared her for the moment she overheard him speaking to her. It was late, past midnight, and the mansion was eerily quiet. Samantha had just finished washing up when she passed Ethan's slightly open bedroom door. The soft glow from the bedside lamp cast long shadows across the floor, and at first she wasn't going to stop, but then she heard his voice, low, quiet, almost desperate. Victoria, he murmured. Samantha's breath caught in her throat. She pressed herself against the wall just outside his door, her heart pounding. I just want to see you, Ethan said, his voice barely above a whisper. Please. Silence. Samantha squeezed her eyes shut. She knew he had been trying to reach Victoria for days. He barely spoke to her, barely even looked at her unless it was to give an order. But hearing the raw ache in his voice as he spoke to the woman who had abandoned him, it hurt in a way she hadn't been prepared for. A long pause stretched between his words. Then, quietly, he let out a bitter laugh. You won't even answer me, will you? He muttered. You ran away, and now you won't even have the decency to pick up the damn phone. Samantha felt something twist deep inside her. For all his coldness, for all his arrogance, Ethan had loved Victoria. And despite everything, he still did. She swallowed the lump in her throat and forced herself to walk away before she heard any more. But that night, as she lay in bed staring at the ceiling, she couldn't stop hearing his voice in her head. The following morning, Samantha woke early, feeling restless. She had been living in Ethan's mansion for nearly 2 weeks now, yet nothing had changed. He still treated her like an afterthought, only speaking to her when necessary, only acknowledging her existence when it was convenient for him. And yet, despite everything, she still wanted to help him. It was ridiculous. It was foolish. But she couldn't shake the feeling that underneath his icy exterior, Ethan was drowning. So, like an idiot, she found herself heading to the kitchen to make breakfast. The mansion staff were off on Sundays, something Ethan had arranged after their marriage, almost as if he wanted to make her responsible for everything. She rolled her eyes at the thought, but as she set out the ingredients, she decided she didn't mind. Cooking gave her something to focus on. Something that wasn't Ethan Carter and his broken heart. She was halfway through preparing scrambled eggs when she realized she hadn't heard a single sound from Ethan's room. Normally, he would have come downstairs by now, making some snide remark or demanding coffee. A strange unease settled in her stomach. She hesitated, debating whether or not to check on him. But when she thought about last night, the way his voice had cracked, the emptiness in his words, she found herself walking toward his room before she could second, guess herself. She knocked. No response. Frowning, she carefully pushed the door open. The room was dark, the curtains drawn, but even in the dim light, she could see Ethan lying on the massive bed, tangled in the sheets. His normally pristine appearance was a mess, his shirt half unbuttoned, his hair disheveled. And the worst part? He was burning up. Panic shot through Samantha as she rushed to his side. His forehead was scorching hot. Ethan, she murmured, shaking a shoulder lightly. Hey, wake up! A low groan escaped his lips, but he didn't open his eyes. Her heart pounded. He was really sick. And knowing him, he probably wouldn't admit it even if he were conscious. She acted fast, fetching a basin of cool water, grabbing towels, and carefully dabbing his forehead. She changed his sweat, drenched shirt, her hands moving on instinct as she worked to lower his fever. After what felt like forever, she finally let herself breathe, settling into the chair beside the bed. Ethan's face was peaceful now, his breathing even. Samantha exhaled, studying him in a way she never had before. For the first time, he looked vulnerable, human. She had only ever seen him as Ethan Carter, the ruthless businessman, the man who barked orders, who never showed emotion, who carried himself with an air of untouchable confidence. But now he just looked exhausted. Without realizing it, she smiled a little. And at some point, without meaning to, she must have dozed off. Ethan stirred hours later, his body aching, but his fever noticeably lower. The first thing he registered was the cool cloth on his forehead. The second was the weight on his arm. He turned his head slightly, his vision blurry at first, but then he saw her. Samantha. She was asleep, her head resting lightly against his forearm, her breathing slow and even. For a long moment, Ethan just stared. He didn't understand why she was here, why she had stayed, why she had taken care of him when he had done nothing but make her life difficult since their marriage. He should wake her, he should pull away. But instead, he found himself watching her. His gaze drifted to the way her eyelashes fluttered slightly, the way her lips parted just a little as she breathed. She looked peaceful. And something about that made his chest tighten. Before he could think about it too much, he carefully shifted his arm, moving her slightly. Samantha stirred, blinking blearily before looking up at him. "You're awake," she murmured, rubbing her eyes. Ethan didn't respond at first. He simply stared at her, something unfamiliar flickering behind his eyes. Then, finally, he spoke. "Why? Why?" Samantha tilted her head. "Why what?" His voice was quieter than usual when he asked, "Why did you stay?" She hesitated, then shrugged, "Because someone had to." For some reason, that answer unnerved him more than anything else. He should have been annoyed. He should have pushed her away. But instead, all he could do was stare at her and wonder why his chest suddenly felt so damn heavy. Samantha wasn't sure what to expect when Ethan finally woke up, but she certainly hadn't anticipated the way he just stared at her. His fever had broken, the heat that had burned through him now reduced to a light warmth under her touch. But his eyes, sharp, calculating, confused, were locked onto her as if she were some kind of puzzle he couldn't solve. She cleared her throat, breaking the silence.
"You should rest a little longer."
Ethan didn't move. He didn't even blink. "You stayed." His voice was rough, hoarse from exhaustion, but the accusation in it was clear. Samantha sighed, sitting back in the chair beside his bed. "Of course I stayed. You were burning up with a fever, Ethan. You didn't have to." She let out a humorless laugh. "Yeah, well, I did." Ethan continued watching her, as if searching for something in her expression. His fingers twitched against the sheets, but he didn't say anything else. Samantha sighed. "I'll get you some food. You probably haven't eaten all day." She stood up, stretching her stiff limbs before heading for the door. "Samantha." Her steps faltered. It wasn't the first time he had said her name, but there was something different about the way it rolled off his tongue this time. She turned back, expecting more of his usual coldness. Instead, his gaze had softened, just slightly, barely noticeable, but enough to make something twist deep in her chest. "Thank you," he said. his voice quieter this time. Samantha wasn't sure what stunned her more, the words or the fact that he actually meant them. She swallowed hard, gave a small nod, then left before she did something stupid. Like let herself believe that maybe, just maybe, Ethan Carter was capable of change. By the time she returned with food, Ethan was attempting to sit up. He looked rough, exhaustion still clinging to him, but his usual composure was slowly returning. She set the tray on the nightstand. Eat. Ethan raised an eyebrow. Bossy. Samantha rolled her eyes. You don't have the strength to be difficult right now, Carter. Something flickered in his expression. A hint of amusement. She couldn't tell. And before she could analyze it, he reached for the bowl of soup, taking a slow sip. He didn't say anything as he ate, but Samantha noticed the way his gaze would flick toward her every few seconds, as if he still didn't understand why she was there. She decided to break the silence. You should have told someone you weren't feeling well. Ethan didn't respond. Samantha crossed her arms. Seriously, Ethan, you push yourself too hard. You're always working, barely eating, barely sleeping. Did it really surprise you that your body finally gave up on you? He let out a slow breath, setting the spoon down. I didn't have time to be sick. Samantha scoffed. Yeah, well, your immune system disagreed. A beat of silence passed, then, to her utter shock, Ethan chuckled. A real, genuine laugh. Deep and warm and completely foreign coming from him. Samantha blinked at him.
Are you seriously laughing at me?
Ethan's lips twitched.
You sound like my assistant.
She folded her arms. I am your assistant. Right, and my wife. The words made her stomach flip unexpectedly. For a second, she forgot how to breathe. Ethan must have noticed because his smirk deepened, clearly enjoying her reaction. Samantha rolled her eyes, recovering quickly. Temporary wife. Something flashed in his expression, so quick she almost missed it. Right, he murmured, his smirk fading. Temporary. A strange, heavy silence settled between them. Samantha cleared her throat, pushing herself off the chair. Anyway, finish eating. I'll check on you later. Ethan didn't stop her as she walked to the door. But just as she reached for the handle, his voice stopped her cold. Samantha. She hesitated, glancing over her shoulder. For a long moment, Ethan just looked at her, something unreadable in his blue eyes. Then he simply said, "Good night." Samantha exhaled. "Good night, Ethan." Then she walked out, unaware that Ethan kept watching the door long after she had gone. The next morning, Samantha woke up expecting things to return to normal. She was wrong. Ethan was different. Not dramatically, not overtly, but subtly. For one, he was speaking to her. At breakfast, instead of ignoring her presence entirely, he actually acknowledged her. You made coffee, he asked, standing in the doorway of the kitchen, freshly showered and dressed in his usual tailored suit. Samantha glanced up from her mug.
Yeah, want some?
Ethan hesitated for a fraction of a second before stepping forward and taking the cup she handed him. His fingers brushed against hers. A tiny, almost insignificant touch, but Samantha felt it everywhere. Ethan didn't comment on it. He simply took a slow sip of the coffee, his gaze lingering on her over the rim of the cup. Not bad, he finally said. Samantha arched an eyebrow. Not bad? Ethan smirked. I've had better. Samantha narrowed her eyes. You're insufferable. Ethan chuckled. For the second time in 24 hours. Something was definitely different. And Samantha had a feeling this was only the beginning. Samantha had barely begun to adjust to Ethan's subtle shift in behavior when the pest came crashing back into their carefully constructed world. It happened on a quiet afternoon. She had just finished sorting through some files in the office when she heard the familiar sound of Ethan's footsteps approaching. She glanced up as he stopped beside her desk, adjusting his cufflinks. "Come with me," he said, his voice steady, unreadable. Samantha frowned. "Where?" "Home." She blinked at him, confused. "It's barely 4. You never leave early." Ethan's jaw tensed slightly, but he didn't elaborate. "Just grab your things." Something about the way he said it sent a chill down her spine. She followed him outside, the silence stretching between them as he drove back to the mansion. Ethan wasn't normally the chatty type, but this silence felt different. Heavy. Samantha was about to ask what was wrong when they pulled into the long driveway, and she saw the figure standing at the front entrance. Her breath caught in her throat. Victoria. Ethan's grip on the steering wheel tightened before he exhaled sharply, his expression hardening. He threw the car into park, but made no move to step out. Samantha turned to him. "Did you know she was coming?" His jaw ticked. "No." For some reason, that made her stomach tighten. Victoria had vanished after the wedding. No calls. No explanations. And now, out of nowhere, she was here. Ethan finally moved, pushing open the door. Samantha followed, her pulse pounding as they approached the woman who had nearly destroyed him. Victoria looked almost the same, flawless, elegant, her wavy auburn hair cascading over her shoulders. But there was something different in her eyes, a nervousness she had never carried before. "Ethan," she said softly. His expression didn't change. "Victoria." Samantha stood stiffly beside him, feeling like an intruder in a moment that wasn't meant for her. Victoria's gaze flickered to her, then back to Ethan. "Can we talk?" A long silence stretched between them. Then, finally, Ethan nodded. Samantha stayed rooted to the spot as Ethan stepped past her. But as he reached the door, he hesitated. Then, without looking back, he said, "Come with me." It took a second for her to realize he was talking to her. Victoria's brows lifted slightly, as if surprised by the invitation. Samantha swallowed hard, but followed hard, unsure of what role she was supposed to play in this. Inside, Ethan led them to the lounge. The tension in the air was suffocating. Victoria took a slow breath, wringing her hands together before finally speaking. "I know I have no right to be here," she admitted. Ethan sat down, his expression cold, distant. "Why are you—" Victoria flinched at his sharp tone. "I just—" Samantha shifted uncomfortably, but kept quiet. Victoria glanced at her again, something like hesitation flickering in her eyes. "Do you mind if I speak to Ethan alone?" Samantha's stomach twisted, but before she could even react, Ethan responded, "No. No." Victoria blinked. "What?" Ethan leaned back, his arm resting along the back of the couch. His face was calm, almost detached. "Anything you have to say, you can say in front of my wife." Samantha's breath hitched at the word. Victoria's lips parted slightly, as if she wanted to argue, but then she slowly nodded. She hesitated for a beat before finally saying, "I didn't leave because I wanted to hurt you, Ethan." Ethan didn't respond, his expression unreadable. Victoria continued, "I was scared. I said yes to the engagement because it felt expected, like I had no other choice." She exhaled, "But I was in love with someone else. I tried to push it away, but when the wedding day came, I couldn't do it. I couldn't do it. I couldn't stand there and say vows that I didn't mean." Samantha clenched her hands into fists, watching Ethan's reaction closely. But he didn't move. He didn't speak. He just listened. Victoria lowered her gaze. I should have told you. I should have been honest from the start. But I was a coward. She swallowed hard. I'm sorry, Ethan. I really, truly am. Silence filled the room. Samantha wasn't sure if she was breathing. Finally, Ethan exhaled, rubbing his jaw. Then, in a voice so low Samantha almost missed it, he said, I waited for you. Victoria flinched. I called you, Ethan continued, his voice steady but laced with something Samantha couldn't quite place. I begged you to talk to me. And you ignored me. Victoria looked away. I didn't know what to say. Ethan let out a humorless chuckle. You could have said anything. Instead, you left me standing at the altar in front of hundreds of people. Victoria swallowed. I know. More silence. Samantha felt like an outsider in a moment too raw, too personal. But Ethan's presence beside her was solid, his body language strangely unaffected. And then, after what felt like an eternity, he said the words that made Samantha's heart stop. I'm not angry anymore. Victoria's head snapped up. What? Ethan shrugged. I thought I would be. I thought I'd hate you. He let out a breath, his eyes meeting hers. But I don't. Victoria looked at him, stunned. Samantha felt something shift in the room. Ethan had been broken the night of the wedding. She had seen it, had felt the weight of his pain every single day since. But now he looked like a man who was finally free. Victoria's eyes misted over and she gave a weak nod. I'm glad. Ethan didn't say anything else. And for the first time since this nightmare had started, Samantha realized something. Victoria wasn't the ghost haunting Ethan anymore. But that didn't mean Samantha was ready for what came next. The night after Victoria left, Samantha expected Ethan to shut himself away in his office, drowning himself in work the way he always did. She thought he would lash out, bury himself in the bitterness of old wounds, or at the very least retreat into his usual cold, emotionless self. But instead, he did something she never saw coming. He changed. At first, it was subtle, so subtle she almost missed it. The next morning, when she came down for breakfast, Ethan was already there, sitting at the head of the table, drinking his coffee. He usually left before she even made it downstairs, always in a rush to get to work. But now, he was just sitting. Morning, he said, his voice calm, almost casual. Samantha nearly tripped over her own feet. Morning. She moved toward the coffee machine, waiting for the inevitable moment when he would grab his briefcase and disappear. But instead, he stayed. Sit, he said, gesturing to the chair beside him. Samantha hesitated. Normally, breakfast at the mansion consisted of her eating alone while he buried himself in work. This was new. Still, she sat, eyeing him warily. Ethan sipped his coffee, his gaze flicking to her. I have a meeting downtown today. You're coming with me. Samantha frowned. I am... He nodded. It's an important deal. I need someone I can trust. Her stomach twisted at the words. Someone I can trust. For years, she had been his most reliable assistant, but he had never said it out loud like that before. Samantha cleared her throat. Okay? He studied her for a moment longer before setting his coffee down. Also, about yesterday. She tensed. Here it was, the part where he pushed her away again. But instead, Ethan leaned back in his chair, his gaze steady. I appreciate what you did, he said simply. Samantha blinked. You... what? I appreciate it, he repeated. Staying. Helping me. She stared at him, waiting for the punchline. The inevitable moment where he would smirk and say something sarcastic. But he didn't. He was serious. She wasn't sure what was more shocking, the words themselves, or the fact that Ethan Carter, the man who never let anyone in, was letting her in. Samantha cleared her throat, unsure of what to say. "You're welcome," she murmured. Ethan nodded, his gaze lingering on her for a second longer before he stood. "Be ready in an hour." Then he walked out, leaving Samantha completely and utterly speechless. The change in Ethan didn't go unnoticed. At the office, he wasn't just tolerating Samantha's presence, he was seeking it out. When they had meetings, he asked for her input. When they worked late, he brought her coffee instead of demanding she fetch his. And when they sat in the cafeteria with the other executives, he actually included her in conversations instead of acting like she was invisible. People noticed. Everyone noticed. "You're spending a lot of time with Mr. Carter these days," one of her co-workers, Lisa, whispered to her at lunch one afternoon. Samantha swallowed a bite of her salad. "I always spend a lot of time with him. I'm his assistant." Lisa smirked. "You're his wife." Samantha nearly choked. "It's not like that." Lisa arched a brow. "Really? Because rumor has it, he's been acting different ever since you two got married." Samantha rolled her eyes, but she couldn't deny it. Because the biggest change wasn't just how Ethan acted around her. It was how she felt around him. He still infuriated her, still got under her skin like no one else. But now, when he glanced at her across the boardroom table, or when his hand brushed against hers as he handed her a document, her stomach did this ridiculous, fluttery thing that she absolutely refused to acknowledge. She told herself it was nothing, just the awkwardness of their situation. But deep down, she knew she was lying to herself. One evening, as she finished organizing paperwork in Ethan's office, the door suddenly opened. She looked up just in time to see Lucas. Samantha smiled. "Hey, what are you doing here?" Lucas grinned. "Was in the area."
I'll take you out for dinner. You up for it?
She hesitated, glancing toward Ethan's desk. He was still in a meeting. "I don't know," she admitted. "It's been a long day." Lucas gave her a knowing look. "Come on, Sam. You need a break. Let me save you from your corporate overlord for a couple of hours." Samantha laughed. Fine. Let me grab my coat." But as she reached for it, the office doors swung open again. "Ethan." His gaze flicked from Samantha to Lucas, and in an instant, his entire demeanor changed. The lightness in his expression disappeared, his jaw tightened, his shoulders squared, and his eyes darkened. Lucas, completely oblivious, held out a hand. "Ethan, right? Good to see you again." Ethan didn't shake his hand. "What are you doing here?" Lucas blinked, lowering his hand. "I came to take Sam to dinner." Ethan's gaze snapped to Samantha. She suddenly felt like she was under a microscope. "Is that so?" he murmured. Samantha swallowed. "It's just dinner." Ethan didn't say anything. But the tension in the room was palpable. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he simply said, "Don't be out too late." His voice was calm, controlled, but his eyes told an entirely different story. And as Samantha walked out with Lucas, she couldn't shake the feeling that she had just crossed a line she didn't even know existed. Dinner with Lucas should have been easy, a casual night out with a friend, a way to forget about the strange shift in her life for a few hours. But from the moment she stepped into the restaurant, Samantha couldn't stop thinking about Ethan. She hated it, hated that his unreadable expression as she left the office was still etched into her mind, hated that even now, while Lucas talked animatedly about some funny thing that had happened at his new job, Her thoughts kept drifting back to the way Ethan's jaw had tightened, the way his eyes darkened, when he realized she was going out with someone else. Sam? You okay? She blinked, suddenly realizing that Lucas had been talking to her. What? Oh, sorry, I spaced out, she admitted, offering him an apologetic smile. Lucas smirked. Let me guess. Work stress? Samantha hesitated. Then, instead of answering, she took a sip of her drink. Lucas studied her for a second before leaning forward. Or, is it your husband? Samantha nearly choked. Lucas laughed. Come on, Sam. Everyone at your office is talking about it. Ethan Carter, the guy who barely acknowledged your existence before, is now acting like a jealous boyfriend every time another man so much as looks at you. That's ridiculous, Samantha muttered, shifting uncomfortably. Is it? Lucas raised an eyebrow. Because if I didn't know better, I'd say your fake husband is starting to forget the fakes part. Samantha rolled her eyes, but she could feel her cheeks burning. I don't know what you're talking about, she said firmly. Ethan doesn't care what I do. Lucas gave her a look. Then why did he look like he wanted to murder me in your office? She opened her mouth to argue, but then her phone buzzed on the table. Her heart stopped. Ethan. Ethan. She stared at his name on the screen, pulse quickening. Lucas raised an eyebrow. Speak of the devil. Samantha hesitated before picking up.
Oh.
Ethan's voice was calm, but there was something off about it. Where are you? Her grip on the phone tightened. I told you, I'm having dinner with Lucas. A pause. Then, softly, come home. Samantha's breath hitched. She glanced at Lucas, who was watching her with curiosity. I'll be back later, she said, forcing her voice to stay neutral. Ethan exhaled through the receiver. Don't be late. The call ended. Samantha set her phone down, suddenly feeling hot all over. Lucas smirked. Yeah, totally not jealous. When she returned to the mansion later that night, the air inside felt different. Ethan was waiting. Not in his office, not upstairs. But right there in the living room, his arms crossed, his expression unreadable. Samantha barely had time to put her bag down before he spoke. How was dinner? She frowned. Good. Why? Ethan's lips twitched, but the smile didn't reach his eyes, just making conversation. Samantha narrowed her eyes. No, you're not. Ethan tilted his head, studying her. You spent 3 hours with Lucas, he mused. You two must have a lot to talk about. She sighed. Ethan, I'm just wondering, he interrupted smoothly. What's so fascinating about him?
Something about the way he said it made her stomach twist.
She shouldn't have felt guilty. She hadn't done anything wrong. But the way Ethan was looking at her, like he was challenging her, like he was daring her to say something that would set him off, made her feel off balance. She crossed her arms. Lucas is my friend, that's all. Ethan let out a quiet chuckle, shaking his head. If you say so. Samantha felt heat rise to her cheeks. Are you seriously doing this right now? You don't care what I do? Remember? Ethan's expression darkened. I never said that. Her heart stopped. A heavy silence stretched between them. Then, before she could think, Ethan took a slow step forward. Samantha's breath caught as the space between them vanished. Ethan didn't touch her, didn't say a word. But the way he was looking at her, like she was something he wanted but refused to take, made her entire body burn. He leaned in, his voice dangerously soft. Did he touch you? Samantha's breath hitched. Her pulse pounded in her ears. She knew she should step back, say something, anything. But she couldn't move. Ethan's gaze flickered to her lips for a fraction of a second, so quick she almost missed it. Almost. Then, just as suddenly, he pulled away. His expression was unreadable again. "Good night, Samantha." And just like that, he walked away, leaving her breathless and completely, utterly confused. Samantha barely slept that night. Ethan's words, his proximity, the way his gaze had lingered on her lips, it all played on a loop in her mind, keeping her restless long after he had disappeared down the hallway. She told herself it didn't mean anything, that Ethan Carter was simply possessive, that he hated the idea of someone, anyone, getting too close to what was technically his. But deep down, she knew that wasn't true. Because if this marriage was just an act, if Ethan really didn't care, then he wouldn't have looked at her like that. Like he wanted her. By the time morning arrived, she was exhausted but determined to shake off whatever strange tension had settled between them. She wouldn't let him get to her. She wouldn't let him make her feel like this was real. The next few days passed in a blur of careful avoidance. Samantha kept her distance. She barely spoke to Ethan unless absolutely necessary. At the office, she stuck to work. Related conversations, keeping things strictly professional. And for the first time since their marriage, Ethan noticed. At first, he didn't react. He watched her quietly, observing the shift in her behavior, as if waiting for her to snap out of it. But when she continued to avoid him, offering clipped responses and refusing to meet his gaze, something in him shifted. It started small. A lingering glance across the boardroom. A casual brush of fingers when he handed her a document. The way he would miraculously show up in the break room just as she was making coffee. But Samantha held her ground. She ignored the tension, ignored the way her heart would stupidly race when he stood too close. And then, one night, everything changed. Ethan had a business dinner with some international investors, the kind that required charm, patience, and an excessive amount of alcohol. Samantha hadn't planned on going, but when Ethan's assistant suddenly fell sick, she was pulled into the last-minute mess. She spent the evening watching him work the room, effortlessly smooth, effortlessly intoxicating. It was frustrating how good he was at this, at talking, at persuading, at commanding attention without trying. And apparently, she wasn't the only one who noticed. Because halfway through the night, a woman at the table, Olivia Brooks, an executive from London, started flirting with him. Hard. Samantha tried not to care. She really did. But when Olivia leaned in, touching Ethan's arm as she laughed at something he said, a sharp, unfamiliar feeling twisted inside her. Jealousy. It was ridiculous. It was insane. But it was there, coiling in her stomach, hot and undeniable. She hated it. Hated the fact that it bothered her. Hated the way Ethan barely reacted, as if he didn't even notice the attention Olivia was showering him with. But the worst part, the moment he did notice Samantha's reaction, because when their eyes met across the table, Ethan's gaze changed. He saw it. He saw the tension in her shoulders, the way she was biting the inside of her cheek, trying to mask her emotions. And instead of ignoring it, he smirked. A slow, knowing, infuriatingly smug smirk. Samantha wanted to throw her wine at him. Instead, she got up. She muttered something about needing air, grabbed her purse and stormed out of the restaurant, her heart pounding. But she didn't even make it 5 steps before a warm, firm grip closed around her wrist. She whirled around, eyes wide. Ethan. He had followed her. His grip was gentle, but his expression was anything but. "Running away," he murmured. Samantha glared. "I just needed a break." Ethan stepped closer. From what? She exhaled sharply, trying to shake off the heat of his proximity. From you. His lips twitched, but his eyes weren't amused. They were intense, focused, hungry. Are you jealous, Samantha? He asked, his voice maddeningly calm. She felt her entire body go rigid. No, she said immediately. Ethan tilted his head, studying her. No. That's what I said. He hummed, as if considering something. Then, suddenly, dangerously, he leaned in. Samantha froze. His lips hovered just beside her ear, his breath warm against her skin. You're a terrible liar, he whispered. A shiver ran through her. Her fists clenched. Ethan. But then, before she could react, before she could stop herself, her hands found his chest, pushing him back. Not roughly. Not forcefully. Just enough for him to notice. And he did. Ethan stared at her, his expression unreadable. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Then, finally, softly, almost reluctantly, he took a step back. His voice was quieter this time, almost conflicted. Go inside, Samantha. She swallowed, her pulse still racing. But she didn't argue. She turned and walked away, feeling his gaze on her the entire time. And as she stepped back into the restaurant, trying to steady her breathing, one thought screamed through her mind. This is getting dangerous. Samantha thought things would settle after that night. She convinced herself that what happened between her and Ethan, the tension, the proximity, the way his voice had sent shivers down her spine, was just a momentary lapse in judgment, a fleeting mistake. But Ethan Carter didn't let things go so easily. If anything, after that night, he became worse. He was everywhere. At work, he called her into his office more often, keeping her close under the guise of needing her assistance. He asked for her opinion during meetings, leaned over her desk when reviewing documents, let his fingers graze hers when handing her a file. At home, he lingered. If she was in the kitchen, he'd appear beside her, casually stealing pieces of whatever she was preparing. If she was watching TV, he'd sit on the opposite end of the couch, stretching his arm along the backrest like it was the most natural thing in the world. None of it was overt. None of it was enough to call him out on. But it was intentional. And it was driving her insane. Then, one evening, everything shifted. Samantha had been in the study finishing up some reports when Ethan walked in. "You're still working?" he asked, his voice smooth as he leaned against the doorframe. Samantha barely glanced up. Someone has to. He smirked. "Come with me." She frowned.
Where?
Ethan didn't answer. He just tilted his head, gesturing for her to follow. Samantha hesitated, then sighed, setting her laptop aside as she stood. She followed him through the mansion, through the dimly lit hallways, until they reached the front door. And that's when she saw it. A sleek black car waiting in the driveway. She turned to Ethan, eyes narrowing. "What's going on?" He didn't answer. He just opened the car door, stepping aside. Samantha exhaled.
You're not going to tell me, are you?
Ethan's lips twitched. "Where's the fun in that?" Against her better judgment, she got in. 30 minutes later, the car pulled up to a private estate nestled deep in the hills outside the city. Samantha stepped out, looking around in confusion. "Ethan," she said slowly, "what is this?" Ethan walked past her, hands in his pockets. "Follow me." She did. And when they stepped into the main garden, she froze. There were lights everywhere, twinkling above them like a constellation. A live band played softly in the distance. The scent of roses filled the air. But the thing that made her stomach drop? The crowd. There were people here. Familiar faces. Ethan's closest business partners. Some of his friends. Even a few members of his family. Samantha's pulse skyrocketed. She turned to Ethan, panic flickering in her eyes.
What?
But then he stepped forward, a microphone suddenly in his hand. The moment he spoke, the entire world disappeared. "Samantha," he said, his voice steady, clear. Her breath hitched. Ethan met her gaze, his blue eyes soft in a way she had never seen before. "I know we're already married," he continued, "but I never gave you a real proposal." Samantha's heart stopped. A murmur rippled through the crowd as Ethan sank down on one knee. A ring glinted in his hand, shimmering under the golden lights. Samantha covered her mouth, completely stunned. Ethan's lips curved into a small, genuine smile. "So, I'm doing it now." She couldn't breathe. "Samantha Reed," he said softly, "will you marry me?" Samantha's breath caught in her throat. She couldn't move, couldn't speak. All she could do was stare at Ethan Carter. The man who had once been nothing more than her cold, demanding boss, now kneeling before her, holding out a ring, waiting for an answer. The entire world had frozen. Gasps and murmurs rippled through the crowd. But Samantha couldn't focus on any of it. Not the people watching, not the twinkling lights, not the music playing softly in the background. All she could focus on was him. The way his blue eyes held no trace of arrogance, no trace of the ruthless businessman she had first met. Just sincerity. Just him. Ethan Carter, the man who had once told her this marriage meant nothing. The man who had once kept his distance, who had once made her feel like she was just an obligation. And now he was here, asking her to marry him again. This time, by choice. A lump formed in her throat. Samantha opened her mouth, trying to find words, but nothing came out. Ethan let out a quiet chuckle, shaking his head. "You're supposed to say something, sweetheart." Her chest ached. Her heart was pounding. She swallowed hard, barely able to breathe. Then, somehow, she nodded. The second she did, Ethan let out a sharp breath, like he had been holding it in for too long. A grin broke across his face. And before she could even process what was happening, he stood, slid the ring onto her finger, and pulled her into his arms. The crowd erupted in cheers. Samantha barely heard it. All she felt was Ethan. His warmth, his strength, the way his arms wrapped around her like he never wanted to let go. And then, before she could think, before she could doubt, before she could question if this was really happening, Ethan kissed her. Not like the first time. Not like the wedding, where it had been forced, where it had been just for show. This kiss was different. It was slow, deep, undeniably real. It was a promise. A confession. And Samantha melted. She clung to him, letting herself fall. Letting herself believe. And for the first time since this entire mess began, she stopped fighting what had always been inevitable. She had fallen for Ethan Carter. Completely. Irrevocably. And there was no turning back. 1 month later, Samantha walked down the aisle. This time, for real. The setting was breathtaking. A private oceanfront estate in California, where the waves crashed gently against the shore, the golden sun beginning its descent into the horizon. White rose petals lined the red carpet, leading her to the man waiting at the altar. Ethan. The first time she had walked toward him in a wedding dress, she had been a replacement, a last-minute solution to a crisis. But now She was his choice. His bride. His real bride. Her chest tightened as she met his gaze. Ethan Carter, once cold, once untouchable, was watching her like she was the only thing that mattered. Like he had been waiting for her his entire life. She barely noticed the guests watching, barely heard the whispers of admiration. All she could hear was the pounding of her own heart as she took those final steps toward him. And then, finally, she was there. Standing before him, his hand reached for hers, warm, steady, certain. "You ready, sweetheart?" he murmured, his voice laced with something deep, something unshakable. Samantha swallowed, her heart swelling as she laced her fingers through his. She smiled. "I am." The ceremony passed in a blur. Vows exchanged, promises spoken. And then, the moment. "You may now kiss the bride," the officiant announced. The crowd cheered. But Samantha barely heard them, because Ethan was already pulling her in. His lips found hers, soft yet demanding, filled with everything he hadn't said out loud. It wasn't just a kiss. It was an admission, a declaration, that he was hers, and she was his. Forever. That night, as they stood on the balcony of their honeymoon suite, Samantha leaned into Ethan's embrace, the warmth of his arms strong, protective, unyielding. The city lights glittered in the distance, but she only cared about the man behind her, pressing a kiss to her temple. "Tell me something," he murmured against her skin. She hummed, "What?" Ethan's grip tightened slightly around her waist. "If I hadn't needed you that day, if Victoria had never left." Samantha stiffened slightly. But before she could answer, Ethan turned her around, cupping her face in his hands. His expression was serious, honest. "I still would have found you," he whispered. Her breath hitched. Ethan's thumb brushed her cheek. "Maybe not that day. Maybe not in that way. But one way or another, Samantha, you are always going to be mine." A lump formed in her throat, because she knew, without a doubt, he meant it. Tears burned her eyes, but she blinked them away, wrapping her arms around his neck. "You're such a sap," she teased, trying to mask how much his words affected her. Ethan chuckled, shaking his head. Then, without another word, he lifted her into his arms, carrying her inside. Their wedding night stretched on, filled with laughter, whispered promises, and slow, lingering kisses. And when Samantha woke up the next morning, wrapped in Ethan's warmth, she realized something. The marriage that had started as a lie had become the truest thing in her life. And she wouldn't change a single thing. Not for the world. Lesson from the story. Life is unpredictable. Sometimes the paths we never intended to take lead us to the most beautiful destinations. Samantha and Ethan's journey started as a mistake, a desperate act to save face, yet through challenges, misunderstandings, and heartbreak, they found something real, love, trust, and a future neither of them saw coming. This story teaches us that love isn't always about grand gestures or perfect moments. It's about choices. Choosing to stay even when things get tough. Choosing to see the best in someone, even when they push you away. And most importantly, choosing to open your heart, even when fear tells you not to. Ethan learned that love isn't about control. It's about understanding and appreciating the person standing beside you. Samantha discovered that strength isn't just about surviving. It's about allowing yourself to be loved. We often chase after the things we think we want, only to realize that what we truly need has been right in front of us all along. Sometimes, life throws unexpected challenges our way. But if we embrace them, they might just turn into our greatest blessings. So take chances. Open your heart. And remember, The best love stories aren't the ones that start perfectly. They're the ones that grow into something real. Where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments. And if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more amazing content.